We're going to turn to God's Word now, and as of this Sunday, we're starting a new series in the book of Joshua in the Old Testament. We're going to dive straight into Joshua chapter 8, so that's page 222. So Joshua chapter 8 on page 222, but let's turn to God in prayer first. Lord God, we know that you esteem the one who is humble and contrite in spirit and who trembles at your words. So please humble us before your word this evening. Give us attentive ears and soft hearts so that we would hear your word clearly and be transformed by it as you work in our hearts by the power of your Spirit. And we pray this for the sake of your glory. Amen. Okay, Joshua chapter 8, starting at verse 1. Then the Lord said to Joshua, "Do not be afraid, do not be discouraged. Take the whole army with you and go up and attack Ai. For I have delivered into your hands the king of Ai, his people, his city and his land. You shall do to Ai and its king as you did to Jericho and its king, except that you may carry off their plunder and livestock for yourselves. Set an ambush behind the city." So Joshua and the whole army moved out to attack Ai. He chose 30,000 of his best fighting men and sent them out at night with these orders: "Listen carefully. You are to set an ambush behind the city. Don't go very far from it. All of you be on the alert. I and all those with me will advance on the city, and when the men come out against us, as they did before, we will flee from them. They will pursue us until we have lured them away from the city, for they will say, 'They are running away from us as they did before.' So when we flee from them, you are to rise up from ambush and take the city. The Lord your God will give it into your hand. When you have taken the city, set it on fire. Do what the Lord has commanded. See to it, you have my orders." Then Joshua sent them off, and they went to the place of ambush and lay in wait between Bethel and Ai, to the west of Ai. But Joshua spent that night with the people. Early the next morning, Joshua mustered his army, and he and the leaders of Israel marched before them to Ai. The entire force that was with him marched up and approached the city and arrived in front of it. They set up camp north of Ai, with the valley between them and the city. Joshua had taken about 5,000 men and set them in ambush between Bethel and Ai, to the west of the city. So the soldiers took up their positions, with the main camp to the north of the city and the ambush to the west of it. That night, Joshua went into the valley. When the king of Ai saw this, he and all the men of the city hurried out early in the morning to meet Israel in battle at a certain place overlooking the Arabah. But he did not know that an ambush had been set against him behind the city. Joshua and all Israel let themselves be driven back before them, and they fled towards the wilderness. All the men of Ai were called to pursue them, and they pursued Joshua and were lured away from the city. Not a man remained in Ai or Bethel who did not go after Israel. They left the city open and went in pursuit of Israel. Then the Lord said to Joshua, "Hold out towards Ai the javelin that is in your hand, for into your hand I will deliver the city." So Joshua held out towards the city the javelin that was in his hand. As soon as he did this, the men in the ambush rose quickly from their position and rushed forward. They entered the city and captured it and quickly set it on fire. The men of Ai looked back and saw the smoke of the city rising up into the sky, but they had no chance to escape in any direction. The Israelites who had been fleeing towards the wilderness had turned back against their pursuers. For when Joshua and all Israel saw that the ambush had taken the city and that smoke was going up from the city, they turned round and attacked the men of Ai. Those in the ambush also came out of the city against them, so that they were caught in the middle with Israelites on both sides. Israel cut them down, leaving them neither survivors nor fugitives. They took the king of Ai alive and brought him to Joshua. When Israel had finished killing all the men of Ai in the fields and in the wilderness where they had chased them, And when every one of them had been put to the sword, all the Israelites returned to Ai and killed those who were in it. 12,000 men and women fell that day, all the people of Ai. For Joshua did not draw back the hand that held out his javelin until he had destroyed all who lived in Ai. But Israel did carry off for themselves the livestock and plunder of this city, as the Lord had instructed Joshua. So Joshua burned Ai and made it a permanent heap of ruins, a desolate place to this day. He impaled the body of the king of Ai on a pole and left it there until evening. At sunset, Joshua ordered them to take the body from the pole and throw it down at the entrance of the city gate, and they raised a large pile of rocks over it, which remains to this day.
Thanks, Douglas. Hi, everyone. My name's Robbie. If we've not met before, particularly warm welcome if it's your first time here at the church. If you're new to Cambridge for the new academic year at one of the universities, I particularly work with undergraduate students. So if you are an undergrad student, I'd love to say hi to you afterwards, if you can hang around. Keep the passage, Joshua chapter 8, open. We struggle, I think, don't we, with this kind of passage. It might just be that it feels really, really irrelevant. It's describing some kind of ancient war. We've just moved to a new city, and unless you've come to do a PhD on ancient Near Eastern warfare and archaeology, then this kind of stuff isn't really what gets you out of bed in the morning, is it? We're more interested in the things that are going on in our daily lives, the struggles of relationships or work or money or whatever it is. For some, though, I think we struggle with the morality of a story like this. It's, I think, hard to imagine a thornier Old Testament issue for the 21st century church than the conquest of the Promised Land. You know, that stuff that's described in the book of Joshua. What some people have called the Canaanite genocide. You read something like this and you can't help but think of the Crusades or violent imperialism in the 19th century or the mass graves in Myanmar or the Ukraine. The kind of really hardcore atheism of someone like Richard Dawkins isn't quite as fashionable now as it was kind of early noughties, but he hits on a raw nerve, I think, when he describes the book of Joshua like this. It's remarkable for its bloodthirsty massacres and the xenophobic relish with which it records them. And if you're not a Christian, and we hope that you feel really welcome as part of our community this evening, you're always very welcome if you're exploring the Christian faith. If you're not a Christian, you might have quite a lot of sympathy for what Richard Dawkins says about the book of Joshua. And even if you are a Christian, you've been a Christian for a while maybe, passages like this are a little bit confusing. Doesn't Jesus in the New Testament say turn the other cheek? We know we don't want to go quite as far as Richard Dawkins maybe and throw God out altogether, but how does this fit in with the kind of thing that we read about when we think about Jesus? What on earth does this kind of passage say about the God that Christians believe in? Well, if you're asking that question, it is a really, really good question. In fact, it's the kind of question that you can ask of pretty much any passage in the Bible. The claim of this book is that God doesn't change. He's the same yesterday, today, and forever. And Jesus says, look, even the Old Testament points forward to me. So any book of the Bible, any passage, if you're saying, what does this teach me about God? Then you're asking a brilliant question. This evening, I don't want to duck those tough issues. I hope we'll have time to think about them. But I also want to let this book shape the agenda and perhaps question us. There are three things, I think, that I want to pick out that we see about the character of God, the kind of God that is described in Joshua chapter 8. The first thing is that he is a God who lavishes his grace and forgiveness on his people. Now, we're diving right into the middle of the book of Joshua. We're actually kind of restarting a sermon series that we started back in 2020. So it's probably helpful as we do that to have a bit of context. Joshua is the 6th book of the Bible. And the first 5 books, the kind of Pentateuch they're sometimes called, describe how God created the world and it was good. But however, since Genesis chapter 3, the story of humanity is a downward spiral of sin, corruption, greed, and violence. But God doesn't give up on the world that he's made. His plan through one man, Abraham, is that he promises that through this guy will come a people who he will establish in the land he's promised, and through whom will come blessing for the whole world. It's kind of like through Abraham's offspring, God's going to deal with that problem of sin that is hardwired into humanity from Genesis chapter 3. He makes what the Bible calls a covenant with Abraham. Now, we don't always use that kind of word. We're perhaps not so familiar with it. But think of a covenant like an agreement or a pact or a kind of handshake between God and humanity. Or if you like, think of it as God getting down on one knee with an engagement ring. Look, I want this relationship to come back on track. It's that sort of level of steadfast commitment and love. So he promises, I will make you into a people, Abraham, and I'll give you a land, and through your people will come blessing for the whole world. And the first 5 books of the Bible kind of tell the story of those promises partially fulfilled. They end with the people of God on the very edge of the promised land, literally about to cross the River Jordan to enter into it. And as things kick off in Joshua, the 6th book of the Bible, things seem to be going pretty great. God's promises, his blessing, his kind of covenant commitment to his people, it's right on track. So in chapter 1, he promises Joshua, look, I will give you every place in this land that you set foot. I will not leave you. I will not forsake you. Be strong and courageous. I'm with you. Chapter 2, Joshua sends some kind of spies in, and they come back and say, look, God's on our side. The people are melting in fear because of us. He's with us. Chapter 3 and 4, they cross over the river. It's kind of like crossing the Red Sea with Moses. They enter the land. God is with them. There's a triumphant procession. And the first battle described, the Battle of Jericho, happens without a single loss of Israelite life. It's that amazing miracle where they march around the city and the whole city is destroyed. It's total victory. God is with them. But then bang in the middle of the first half of the book of Joshua, chapter 7, you get a surprising defeat. Just flick back the page to chapter 7, because you can't really understand chapter 8 without this little bit of chapter 7. Verse 2, now Joshua sent men from Jericho to Ai, which is near Bethaven to the east of Bethel, and told them, go up and spy that region. So the men went up and spied out Ai. When they returned to Joshua, they said, not all the army will have to go up against Ai. Send 2,000 or 3,000 men to take it, and don't weary the whole army, for only a few people live there. So about 3,000 went up, but they were routed by the men of Ai, who killed about 36 of them. They chased the Israelites from the city gate as far as the stone quarries and struck them down on the slopes. At this, the hearts of the people melted in fear and became like water. So Ai, okay, chapter 8, it's not the first time we've met this city of Ai. It's not a very big place, tiny little village really, in comparison to some of the other places described in the book of Joshua. And maybe they're a little bit cocky when these spies come back, but they've just seen what God has done in the city of Jericho. You hang back on this one, Joshua. It'll be fine. It's like a kind of Premier League side going into the early rounds of the FA Cup. This is one for the reserves, guys. But read end of verse 5 again. Their hearts melted and became like water. They're routed so badly that it almost like becomes, they're just as scared as the Canaanites were at the beginning. This is not how it's meant to be. It's the wrong way round. The defeat is a huge humiliation. And we discover as we read chapter 7 that this is all due to just one man's sin. The narrator tells us the problem in verse 1. The Israelites were unfaithful in regard to the devoted things. Achan, son of Carmi, the son of Zimri, the son of Zerah, the tribe of Judah, took some of them, and the Lord's anger burned against Israel. Because of this one guy, Achan, stealing something from Jericho when God said, don't do that. The whole nation faces the consequences. What he does, it's not just a little bit of greed. It represents a kind of covenant rebellion. It's like he takes the engagement ring off his finger and throws it away. Now, I haven't got time to recap the whole chapter, but it ends as God's anger, which burned against Israel, chapter 7, verse 1, is turned away. If you just flick over the page, chapter 7, verse 26. The problem is sin is dealt with, but you can imagine how Joshua, the leader of God's people, is feeling. We messed up big time. It was supposed to be the promised land. It started so well. What is going to happen next? And into this context, verse 1 of chapter 8 comes as a soothing balm that washes over him, doesn't it? Look again at verse 1, the first thing that God says. Then the Lord said to Joshua, Do not be afraid. Do not be discouraged. Can you imagine the relief that Joshua must have felt hearing this? God's grace abounds in comfort and assurance. Yes, you guys messed up, but I'm the God of the second and the third and the fourth and the fifth and the sixth and the seventh chance. He's a God who abounds in grace. Notice how his grace is immediate. There's no chapter divisions in the original. And it kind of moves. I think presumably it's the very same day that the events of chapter 7 happen. There's no kind of cooling off period. We sometimes think that that's how it works with God, don't we? So you have a bit of a wobble or you do something you know you shouldn't, and you kind of think to yourself, I better just leave it a week or two before I come to church. Or I better just get myself back into the right sort of frame of mind before I say sorry to God and pick up my Bible again. Give God a bit of space to get over it. But that is not how he works. He's abounding in lavish and immediate grace. Not just immediate, but lavish or generous. Look at verse 1 and 2 as well. So he says, don't be afraid, don't be discouraged. Take the whole army with you and go up and attack Ai. For I've delivered into your hands the king of Ai, his people, his city, and his land. You shall do to Ai and its king as you did to Jericho and its king, except that you may carry off their plunder and livestock for yourselves. The one difference between the battle in Ai and the battle in Jericho is that this time they can do the very thing that Achan got into trouble for in the first place. Now, it's not exactly clear why God makes this change. Maybe there was something symbolic about Jericho, that very first city. Maybe he just realizes that without all the manna from their journeying in the wilderness, the people are going to get hungry and they need these provisions. But you can't help but think for Achan, look, God, if only you'd waited. You could have had all the plunder you wanted. God is he's not tight-fisted. He just wanted you to obey that one command. The pastor, Dale Ralph Davis, has this little phrase, serpent theology. What he means is that sin only becomes plausible when what we think about God is distorted. That's what happened in the Garden of Eden. That's why he calls it serpent theology. The serpent said to the woman, did God really say you can't eat from any tree in the garden? Of course he didn't say that. In fact, his first words were to Adam and Eve were, guys, you're free. You're free to eat from any tree in the garden. There's just this one tree that I'd rather you didn't. But the serpent, he's cunning. He plants this little seed of doubt about the character of God, and in so doing makes sin so much more plausible. Guy's a killjoy. He just wants to wring you dry. God is not good. He doesn't have your best interests at heart. But if you've read any of the Bible, then you'll know that is so far from the truth. He is a God of lavish generosity. And how much more do we know that as Christians? He who did not spare his own son, Paul says in Romans 8, but gave him up for us all, how will he not also, along with him, graciously give us all things? His grace is immediate, it's lavish, it's certain. There's one little detail. I wonder if you picked it up as Douglas read through the text. Verse 17, just look at it. Suddenly, out of nowhere, you get a mention. Actually, it's in verse 12 the first time it comes. Actually, no, sorry, it's in verse 9 the first time it comes. Suddenly, out of nowhere, you get mention of the place Bethel. Okay, now, there's no kind of, it comes completely out of the blue, and you think, well, if I'm not really interested in Israelite geography, I'll just completely ignore that, whatever. But whenever the Old Testament mentions names, they're kind of important. It seems that Ai was actually a bit of a kind of garrison town maybe, or an outpost for this slightly larger city of Bethel, and they end up taking both. But the key thing about Bethel is that it's in Bethel that's the very place where Abraham first receives that promise of the covenant. Genesis chapter 12, verse 8. It's in Bethel that God says, look around you. This land that you're in, this is going to be your land. As if to really ram home one of the major themes of the whole Old Testament, that God is absolutely committed to his covenant promises. In spite of our sin, in spite of our failure, it's like he's a God who picks through the grass and the mud to find that engagement ring that we've tossed away, and he gets it and he kind of wipes it off and he keeps coming back. Look, I am going to stick to that promise that I made, for better, for worse. He's the God who uses people and sticks with them in spite of their mistakes and failures. He's a God of grace. I just wonder this evening, do you know that he is like that? Here's the second thing I think we see about God. He's the God who gives victory. The God who gives victory. So verse 1, God promises that the whole city of Ai is there for the taking. And he kind of comes up with this strategy, end of verse 2, set an ambush behind the city. Now, the rest of the chapter goes into the kind of details of the attack and the kind of ambush and things like that. It's actually the most detailed battle in the whole of the book of Joshua. Now, before we dismiss it by saying, oh, they were so barbaric back then, imagine them glorifying violence like this. Let's just pause and examine ourselves. Okay, I was reading, apparently, Netflix claimed that 142 million households watched Squid Game in the first month that it was released. Did anyone watch it? I won't ask you to put your hands up, but it's basically a kind of Korean TV show that takes classic children's games and imagines that there's a setup where, like kind of cute, innocent children's games always end up with somebody dying. Look, we will tackle the elephant in the room, okay, about why God commands genocide, or why God commands this, and whether or not it's genocide. But let's admit that our own relationship with violence in the 21st century world isn't quite as squeaky clean as we'd like to think. Violent movies or video games or whatever. Now, the gist of what happens is quite straightforward, even though some of the details of the passage are a little bit sometimes a bit confusing to understand. Verse 3 to 8, you get Joshua and the people preparing for battle. You can picture those kind of classic scenes in something like Gladiator or whatever, where they kind of give the rousing speech before everything happens. Look, here's the plan, guys. I'll stay here with the army. There's going to be a group that goes around the back, and when they come out, you guys go in. That's how it's going to work. Then, verses 9 to 13, everyone gets into position. Now, I'm not sure exactly whether there's one night described or 2 nights. Where does Joshua spend the night? How many people are in the ambush? Verse 3, it says 30,000. Verse 12, it says 5,000. I think it's probably that Joshua has a force of 30,000 people and then says 5,000 round the back. But I think it's not meant to be a strict chronological account, I don't think. It moves slightly back and forth. But what is clear from what's described is that the king of Ai is completely taken in by this plan. So look at verse 14. When the king of Ai saw this, he and all the men of the city hurried out early in the morning to meet Israel in battle at a certain place overlooking the Arabah. But he didn't know that an ambush had been set against him behind the city. Joshua and all Israel let themselves be driven back before them, and they fled towards the wilderness. All the men of Ai were called to pursue them, and they pursued Joshua and were lured away from the city. Not a man remained in Ai or Bethel who didn't go after Israel. They left the city open and went in pursuit. It's actually very cleverly written. It's exactly what has happened to the Israelite force before. They kind of tread that same path of retreat. So you see where the king of Ai thinks, oh, to everyone watching, this just looks exactly the same as before. They're heading back into the wilderness, back to where they came from. But things are not as they seem. And that word see is actually repeated a bunch of times in here just to make that point. You can feel the tension in verse 16 and 17. Not a single person left behind in Ai or Bethel. Oh, guys, it's coming. And verse 18 is the turning point. At Joshua's signal, the ambush rushes into the empty city, sets it on fire, and the kind of rising smoke is a signal for Joshua and the others to turn and to counterattack back. The king of Ai and his army are kind of caught in the middle, and it's an overwhelming Israelite victory. Now, in all the details of the battle, and I don't know whether that kind of thing excites you or not, the author of the text wants to tell us this one key thing. I think actually it's pretty obvious. It is God himself who is behind this victory. Yeah, it's a slightly bigger force than their previous attack on Ai. Yeah, there's some complicated stuff about the ambush, but even that's God's idea. But this point about God being behind the victory is rammed home. Look at verse 1 again. He says, I have delivered into your hands the king of Ai. So certain he can almost announce it beforehand. Verse 8, Joshua describing to the people what's going to happen. When you've taken the city, set it on fire, do what the Lord has commanded. See to it. You've got my orders. That is the chain of command working as it should. And it's especially clear in verse 18. The Lord said to Joshua, hold out towards Ai the javelin that is in your hand. For into your hand I will deliver the city. So he does. And as long as his hands are up, I think, where does it say that at the end? Verse 26, he didn't draw back his hand until all who have been destroyed who live there. As long as his hand is up, God provides the victory. It's the Lord himself who hands over this city. And if you're into this sort of thing, there's heaps of echoes of Exodus chapter 14 here. The victory at Ai, it's if the author's saying, look, the victory at Ai is no less miraculous than the greatest defeat in Israelite history. Pharaoh, the Egyptians, the Red Sea, Moses holding out his arms. It's no less miraculous than that. The Lord is behind this victory. The key issue when determining the success of God's people is that God is with them. He's the one who gives victory. Now, I don't know whether the victory of God is something that you think about very much. I wonder if sometimes in our circles, we're sometimes a bit worried that an overly optimistic presentation of the Christian life that kind of claims victory over sickness now or financial problems now or whatever, we know that that's slightly off. So we kind of maybe downplay the fact that God is the one who is victorious. Or maybe we just sometimes feel really, really weak. But if we're trusting in Christ, the reality is that he has already delivered victory into our hands. He has triumphed over all evil and sin in his death on the cross. There is nothing less left for us to do than to trust him and enjoy the victory he's won. Now, it's true, there are some big differences between Christians now and Israelites back then. Our battle is not against flesh and blood, Paul says in Ephesians chapter 6. So actually, those accounts of Christian violence, the 11th century Crusades or the 15th century wars of religion, or violence carried out in the name of kind of civilizing imperialism or whatever, those things are not just morally wrong and things that have nothing to do with Christianity, but also just bad theology. They get the Bible wrong as well. The ultimate fulfillment of those promises to Abraham is not found in some kind of land now, but in the new creation. Sometimes the victory in the Christian life, the kind of idea of victory in the Christian life doesn't really feel like it, does it? I mean, actually, that is the case here as well. At first, it looks like defeat. It looks like they're fleeing back to the wilderness to where they came from. And I don't know if you can relate to that sort of experience. The church feels small. The world seems like a very dark place. My own struggles with sin just kind of overwhelm me. But the reality is, as we sung actually in the song just now, that at the end of time, God will be revealed as the great victor over all evil, the world, the flesh, and the devil. Though the war appeared as lost, Christ has triumphed over evil. It is finished upon the cross. He's the God who is victorious. Final thing. He's the God who judges justly. The God who judges justly. Verse 24 through to the end. It's kind of like the aftermath of the battle here. There's total victory over everything. And it's quite sobering to read, isn't it? Especially something like verse 25. 12,000 men and women fell that day, all the people of Ai. Now, what is going on here? How can God command something like this? Well, there's something we're expected to pick up, I think. Did you notice that little detail about the king? So verse 23, they bring the king alive. Now, verse 29, he impaled the body of the king of Ai on a pole and left it there until evening. At sunset, Joshua ordered them to take the body from the pole and throw it down to the entrance of the city gate, and they raised a large pile of rocks over it, which remains there to this day. Now, it's actually a direct reference to a command that God makes in the book of Deuteronomy. Deuteronomy chapter 21, verse 22 and 23, describes how if someone's guilty of something really bad, then the thing that they're to do is to be put to death and impaled on a pole or exposed on a pole or a tree. They can't be left there overnight, so they're to be taken down. And you can see here then that Joshua is really keen to follow what God says in the law, but it also helps us to understand what is going on. It's easy to misunderstand this idea, the cursed one is hanging on a tree. They're not cursed because they're on the tree or the pole, as if it's just kind of an embarrassing or a shameful way to die. No, it's the other way around. In Deuteronomy, it's because they've done something awful that merits that particular punishment. They're hanging on the tree because they are accursed by God. And I think this really gets us to the very heart of that kind of apologetic question. Although it's hard to swallow, and there are some more things to say, and you can chat to me afterwards if you want to, the conquest of the land is ultimately God's act of judgment against the sin of the people in the land. There's a slide, if we can have the slide on the screen from Deuteronomy chapter 9. God makes it really clear in Deuteronomy chapter 9, verse 5. He says to the Israelites, look, it's not because of your righteousness or your integrity that you're going to take possession of their land, but on account of the wickedness of these nations. The Lord your God will drive them out before you in order to fulfill the promise that the Lord made on oath to your ancestors, to your fathers, to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Conquest of the land is nothing to do with how good the people are. It is to do with it is in part to do with God's judgment on those living there. Notice. I'm conscious this is it's hard stuff to hear. You can always, whenever you say something like this, you can always feel the kind of tension in the room. But notice a few things about God's judgment. It is not rash and kind of flying off the handle. In fact, you can go back if you're taking notes and look at Genesis chapter 15, verse 16. One of the reasons that it takes hundreds of years in the history of God's people for them to enter the promised land is because God says that their sin is not bad enough yet to merit the kind of judgment that conquest means. In other words, God is slow to anger. He's abounding in steadfast love. It's held back, his judgment, until it's actually merited. He waits literally 400 years. But eventually justice is done. Nor is it anything to do with ethnicity. This is where I think the kind of genocide label is actually not quite accurate. This is super clear. If we can have to Genesis in the Deuteronomy 9 one back up again, it's super clear there. It's not because of their righteousness or because of their ethnicity or because they're Israelites or anything like that. In fact, the reason that God says, look, you've got to completely destroy everything is because he knows that any little bit of Canaanite religion left behind is going to impact his people. They're no better than the Canaanites. This isn't about ethnic cleansing or genocide. It is about how people treat God. The Bible describes the sins of the Canaanites as really awful. You can look up later if you want to, Deuteronomy chapter 12, verse 31, that talks about their practices of child sacrifice. And actually, some of that has actually been confirmed by archaeology too. It's not about ethnicity. And in fact, just look ahead, a little sneak preview of chapter 8, verse 33. It describes a kind of ceremony, which we'll look at next week, which has all the Israelites there. All the Israelites, verse 33, with their elders, officials, and judges were standing on both sides of the Ark of the Covenant of the Lord, facing the Levitical priests who carried it. Both the foreigners living among them and the native-born were there. Okay, so by the time that this victory happens, and then they kind of go and renew a covenant, which we'll look at next week, the people of Israel is not just ethnic Israelites. It includes the Egyptians who've come out of Egypt with them, who've seen God's wonders and repented of their sin, and taken that Passover lamb and put it over their doorposts. It includes Canaanites like Rahab, the prostitute, and her family, who've realized what's coming, that the writing's on the wall, and turned to the living God. This isn't about ethnic cleansing. The offer is there for anybody. It's also, lastly, this stuff about judgment, not unique to the Old Testament. You'll know if you've read the Gospels that Jesus Christ speaks more clearly than anyone else in the Bible about hell and the reality of judgment. Now look, you may still be struggling, and I get it. I'm not trying to tell you off. Our practice here at St. Andrew the Great is just to kind of preach through the Bible as it comes, and I think this is what chapter 8 of Joshua is all about. But I wonder whether we sometimes struggle with the idea of judgment because we don't always see the seriousness of our sin. There's a theologian, a Harvard theologian called Miroslav Volf, who has a very interesting account on this. He says, I used to think that the wrath of God was unworthy of him. Isn't God love? Shouldn't divine love be beyond God's wrath? God's love, and he loves every person, every creature. That's exactly why God is wrathful against some of them. My last resistance to the idea of God's wrath was a casualty of the war in former Yugoslavia, a region from which I come. He writes, according to some estimates, 200,000 people were killed and over 3 million were displaced. My villages and the cities were destroyed. My people shelled day in and day out, some of them brutalized beyond imagination. And I could not imagine God not being angry. How does God react to this kind of carnage? By doting on the perpetrators in a kind of grandfatherly Father Christmas fashion? by refusing to condemn the bloodbath, but instead affirming the perpetrator's basic goodness? Wasn't God fiercely angry with this injustice? Though I used to complain about the indecency of the idea of God's wrath, I came to think that I would have to rebel against a God who wasn't wrathful at the sight of the world's evil. God isn't wrathful in spite of being love. He is wrathful because he is love. It's a profound statement, isn't it? The reality is that the whole world will one day face the judgment of God. He will right every wrong and judge each person according to what they've done. And for those who know injustice firsthand, there's something deeply good about Judgment Day. But for all of us, if we're honest, we know that we cannot stand before him and plead innocence. And Joshua chapter 8 should send us to Jesus as the only safe place to hide in the face of God's judgment. So he's a God of grace, a God of victory, and a God of judgment. And you might ask, well, where is Jesus in a story like this? Well, we've said it already this service, actually. We're going to have the final verse up on the screen. Galatians chapter 3, Paul, picking up that verse from Deuteronomy, describes how Jesus Christ, in his death on the cross, faced the judgment that we deserve. He redeemed us from the curse of the law by becoming a curse for us. Cursed is everyone who is hung on a pole. Jesus Christ takes the punishment that we deserve, that the King of Ai here experiences, but that by nature each one of us deserve, because he loves us, because he wants us back. Do not be afraid, the Lord said to Joshua. Do not be discouraged. This is the kind of God that Joshua 8 is all about. Let me say a prayer. Father, I'm really conscious that what we've covered is quite heavy. It's hard to hear sometimes about your justice and your judgment. But Father, we thank you for showing to us the depths and the realities of our sin, how far we fall short, and for revealing to us your character. You are abounding in grace and steadfast love and commitment to your people, that you come back to us and give us second and third and fourth and fifth and sixth and seventh chances. Thank you that you are a God who, through Jesus' death on the cross, has won victory over all evil. And thank you, at the end of the day, that you are a God who judges justly, and that those who trust in Christ are redeemed from the curse of the law. In Jesus' name.